Good evening, everybody. I'm Jeff Urban, the Education Director at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. And I'm so glad that you're able to join us for tonight's discussion with Alexander Heffner and Brenda Wineapple, which I promise is going to be interesting, engaging, and informative. We're delighted to have you tune in for these discussions because it gives us an opportunity to highlight the kinds of things that we have in our exhibits and also in our archives. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Brenda Wineapple, who is going to be our lead discussion person with Alexander here tonight. Now, Brenda is a author of many books, including The Impeachers, The Trial of Andrew Johnson, and The Dream of a Just Nation, A Static Nation, Confidence, Crisis, and Compromise, 1848 to 1877, and White Heat, The Friendship of Emily Dickinson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. She's received a literature award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Pushcart Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, 2 National Endowment Fellowships in the Humanities, and most recently, a National Endowment Public Scholars Award. So she is a busy, busy person. An elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Society of American Historians, she regularly contributes to major publications such as the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, the Wall Street Journal, and The Nation. So I would like to go ahead and introduce her, but before I do that, I want to remind you that you can ask questions toward the end of the presentation. We'll put up a little crawler across the bottom of the screen. You can type your questions either into the Facebook comments or also into the YouTube chat. So Brenda Wineapple, I'm going to turn it over to you to start our presentation tonight.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Very nice of you, and it's a real pleasure to be virtually at the FDR Library and virtually with someone I admire enormously, and I'll be presumptuous enough to call him a friend because I hope he is. That's Alexander Heffner, who is really the star of tonight's show. I'm just the enabler, and I'm happy to be that way. A little bit nervous about enabling someone like Alexander, who is himself a wonderful interviewer. Excuse me, I'm sure many of you are here because you have seen him on the Open Mind on PBS, where he conducts a range of interviews with all kinds of people and all kinds of issues, particularly politics. But his knowledge is vast, his commitment is deep, his excitement and enthusiasm is contagious. And so it's no wonder you can see him also on NPR, C-SPAN, a host of media channels. And fortunately for us, he writes really very often for all kinds of publications like USA Today, Washington Post, you name it pretty much. I could go through the long list, but I think we're already boring you with credentials. Alexander certainly has enough of them. I personally, on a more personal note, I think, and Alexander, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've done 3 programs together, which is huge. It's exciting. And so I'm very honored to be a part of this one and to talk with Alexander about this absolutely marvelous documentary history of the United States, which to my mind is needed now more than ever. This kind of book that opens up a range of voices, points of views, lessons really about the nature of the country we live in and the people who have been so instrumental in trying very hard to make a more perfect union. So enough of me. Really, I have a number of questions, but let me just let Alexander talk a little bit just about the origins of this book and in relation to that, how so many to choose from, how you chose the excerpts you chose. Hi, Alexander.
Hey, Brenda, it's really wonderful to see you. And it is an honor to join you. Like you said, this is our third program together, and the first of which the tables have been turned.
I know.
So I'm grateful for you accepting this opportunity. And I think one of my last in-person
Mhm.
restaurant meals was with you at Hyde Park when I was having a conversation with you on your wonderful book, and I know you're working on another, and hope to preview that for some of our viewers and listeners today. The book was started by my grandfather um, because there was nothing quite like it when he was in school. In the 30s and 40s, there weren't the history textbooks that you're familiar with now by Brinkley or
Mhm.
Kennedy or Nash, and and they were all written by men, yes, and a lot of them and a lot of the generations that followed in the 70s through the present have read some variety of U.S. history textbooks written by um, men, male professors of the academy. But what didn't exist was Wikipedia in the 1950s, and also Britannica was available, but primarily to folks who would want to go to their local library or
Mhm.
probably more their academic institution's library. It wasn't easy to find, and so that he invented this book as a chronology, compilation, an anthology of the most essential U.S. history texts, because at the time nothing really existed like that. If you
Mhm.
wanted to become really knowledgeable about a subject, you read a biography, like one of your biographies,
Mhm.
or history period pieces
Sure.
of 500 pages. And so it was filling this void, and he decided it was important enough and got enough interest from college professors and even high school teachers, and probably even at the middle school
Mhm.
level, to keep updating it
Mhm.
for successive editions all the way through now the 11th. And so before he passed, he asked me to join him, knowing that I had followed in his footsteps as a history major, writing a lot of history and journalism. And so together we updated the 8th and 9th editions. And then the 10th edition was my first solo edition. And when I say edition, it's an essay followed by a series of documents that
Right.
reflects that period. And so this 11th edition is my second update as a solo. But that's the genesis of the project.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think it's still a unique thing, even with all those textbooks in circulation today.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think, as I said, it's absolutely necessary, and it's fun. I want to tell anybody out there that it's a lot of fun to read because you do. um, I hope this is okay to say, but I'm going to say it
Sure.
anyway. You don't
Yeah.
have to start at the beginning and go to the end.
Right.
I mean, you can take the period that you want. You can take the abolitionist legacy. You can take the Gilded Age. You can take the progressive movement. You can take, it goes all the way up to very much now. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but you can take the pandemic, for example. You can take social justice movements. I mean, there's a range of materials here, and then you can take things you may not know about. Maybe not everybody knows about John Calhoun speaking on, the National Bank, and also another pitch. It seems to me, and again, I hope I'm not saying anything terrible, Alexander. You tell
No,
me
I
for
welcome
sure.
it.
But no, but two other things. One is the excerpts aren't long, so that you really, what it is, it's an introduction, and it's an introduction in the best sense. So if you want to know more about Martin Luther King or the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, that really, in some sense, started the women's movement in this country. Um, you can go to Wikipedia. You can call a friend. You can find out more on your own. But it's a wonderful kind of in the best words, I think a wonderful kind of civics lesson. And I find that really very, very exciting. I'd also say, both to you and your grandfather, because I know you've done a lot of the sort of, they're not really head notes, but I'm glad you mentioned them, Alexander, because each section is introduced by the narrator, by Alexander, speaking about what, just giving that little context. And in that alone, we have really some exciting history lessons. A couple of questions that I had. One thing that I, because I love literature, I noticed that there's Walt Whitman here, and is a section from, not his poetry, from Democratic Vistas, which people may not be familiar with, but now they will be. And I was wondering if you considered, especially in the revised editions that you were more in charge of, putting in more literature. I mean, it must have been really hard to choose what to put in.
Yes. And
Nightmare, in fact.
yeah, very challenging.
Yeah.
And I think that there are those unsung heroes and heroines, primarily heroes of literature and cultural commentary in the book, who don't appear in
Yeah.
a Zinn book or a Brinkley book, history text. They're not documents that are excerpted, and they're certainly not discussed in paragraphs in U.S. history surveys. So I think that it didn't dawn on me for this 11th edition to include anything literary, just because of the seemingly insurmountable task of synopsizing the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, I kind of pull my own leg, and just it's not such a terribly long essay or task to, it shouldn't be so exhaustive. But when you think of encapsulating so many moving pieces, like I say in this updated edition, in the newest chapter, a pandemic, 3 Supreme Court appointments, 2 impeachments, the Christmas song goes
that
on.
was just yesterday.
Yeah. And so the thing that I incorporate as sort of a literary kind of skill or flourish is more in my own sentence structure, which I tried to model after my grandfather. It sort of came naturally to me, which is just having to jam pack so many salient details in a limited number of words.
Yeah.
Because this
you're good at that as a journalist, and I think
right.
You have
and I'm having more liberties now to do it in the book format. But no, there was something that I considered. It didn't make the final cut just because of the amount of sort of more traditional documents. One thing that my grandfather never did up until the edition that we wrote together when he was still alive, that chapter was include interviews, broadcast interviews. And we thought that 2 interviews that Vice President Cheney,
they were remarkable. Yeah, they were great.
And we found that it was honestly the most clear-eyed understanding of the rationale, and then having to be accountable for the events that transpired with the Iraq War. And Cheney being one of the foremost and likely most persuasive advocate of that war behind the scenes, it seemed appropriate at the time to. So he had never done that. He had included a speech by Edward R. Murrow, but it wasn't an interview that Murrow had conducted. It was just a speech on the power of television news. So with this edition, understanding the obsession with photos unleashed by Instagram, starting with Facebook, you probably saw them. These 2 black and white photos that, again, to me, encapsulated this time period. and will be remembered during the years for which
Right.
we're responsible chronicling the
Right.
the COVID memorial site during the 2020 campaign
Right.
in DC, and the image of the last U.S. soldier departing
Right.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. Yeah.
And it never occurred to him, or maybe he just didn't think that it was appropriate to include the photos alongside text, but it seemed necessary now, just because so much. I mean, I know you have family and younger family who are probably more active on Instagram than you may be or may not be. I don't think you're on Instagram, but I don't want to
I'm
speak.
not.
But I mean, I just know that even my parents, like it's
Yeah.
one parent who is very much ingrained in that culture,
Hmm.
one parent who is still refuses to have a Facebook and an Instagram or anything, nothing. So it's not just my fellow 30 somethings or 40 somethings who it's 50, 60. I mean, a lot of I would
Yeah.
say much of contemporary living society is obsessed with these social platforms that are focused on
Absolutely.
photos. So
Absolutely.
for me, it was a necessary thing to do,
Yeah.
just like it was necessary to include Trump tweets in the
Well,
11th.
that's what I want. I wanted to bring that up because one of the things I liked about that, quite apart from the content, quite apart from Trump for just a second, is the fact that our whole sense of language and how we communicate is changing. And it's not just, yes, the visual. I understand that, but since I'm still very much part of the print culture, you to a certain extent, you still
Yeah.
are, but
Oh yeah.
but since you're involved, but since you're involved in television, you're comfortable in media in a different, no, seriously, in a different
Yeah.
way. But I thought, that's so interesting to have both the interviews. You mentioned the Cheney interviews, the two of those, which, two different interviewers, which was interesting too.
Yeah.
And, but also then the tweets, which came as kind of a surprise. And, so much encapsulated right there about the culture, never mind as again about the president or about what he was saying, just the culture, just how we talk to one another, the way we use language. And I thought that was a brilliant update, really,
Yeah.
and in some sense, when I say, did you consider other literary, that's tough because, as you say, another reason it would be tough is copyright. You don't even want to go there,
Yeah.
because if you're doing the very contemporary stuff, everything's in copyright.
Right.
But forgetting that, because we communicate, as you're saying, so differently, I think that's really important. And that was really, I really thought a brilliant choice. Going back to Cheney for a second, because I'm obviously encouraging everybody to read this book and read around in this book, but certainly the Cheney interviews bring back a whole era and a voice that is kind of stunning in its refusal to second guess himself, refusal to back down on anything. The sort of clarity and self-confidence of a vision that I think, to a certain extent, maybe people would argue, maybe you would argue, Alexander, has been proved wrong. But in any event, especially when you talk about torture, but putting that aside, putting torture aside for a minute, I thought it was so interesting that you included then Liz Cheney. Talk about of the moment, right?
Yes.
When we get off, there's a January 6th meeting tonight here,
Right.
and that she's chairing. So
yeah. No, I'm so glad
tell us
you
about
asked.
your thoughts. Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked it and framed it in that way, because the Cheneys kind of bookend each
Yeah.
other, and in one instance, in the sort of revised history of Iraq, it wasn't like this from the beginning,
Right.
but in the sort of contemporary understanding of the war, as and I think that this understanding has further evolved. I mean, when you think of what happened in Afghanistan relative to what happened in Iraq, you
True.
could argue that was the more successful of the two military interventions.
Well,
And
somebody, I don't know if it's you or your grandfather, called, I think the sort of the Bush senior in Kuwait, I guess it was, it's
right,
brilliant, that the sort of brilliant coalition and handled it very well. So
right,
you're
right,
absolutely right.
exactly.
Go ahead.
So,
Yeah.
so and I think that the early 2000s, or I should say, kind of the 2006 period in which the Democrats took back the Congress as a function of the mismanagement of the Iraq War, or even if not mismanagement, the ongoing death toll. The 2006 to sort of 2016 understanding of that war versus the 2016 to 2022 understanding of that war, I think they're different, and that folks are more likely to not necessarily view the administration's position as credible or successful, but the ultimate outcome in the region as Iraq being a more stable country and regime. And maybe it was always going to be that way because Iraq was a more developed society than Afghanistan by such an
Well,
extent.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
Liz Cheney, in short, she is included. This is a moving target, so we include the articles of impeachment
yeah.
in Congresswoman Cheney's speech in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection. And even though the book was scheduled at a point that we could not include testimonies from this hearing, the two speeches convey the same idea of corruption, lack of accountability, and democracy being something that was undermined as a result of President Trump's post-election conduct. And so I'm really glad we were able to include Cheney, and these are serious public servants. You mentioned the tweets. One of the things that I think and I know you're going to ask me about the edition of Charles Sumner and the 11th edition, which, if you go back and look at the 10th edition and every edition that came before it, my grandfather was infatuated with Lincoln. As you know, I'm infatuated with Sumner.
I do know. Now everybody knows.
Yeah. But you and I both are. But in any event, the people questioned the inclusion of the tweets.
Oh yeah,
not
really?
terribly many, but and I concur with your judgment of its brilliance. If only
Good.
it accurately documents the mode in which political communications was occurring, that allowed for the distortion of fact, the disinformation, and the fact that we had a president, and before that a presidential candidate, communicating in syllables, in 140 characters.
Yes.
That was an unprecedented thing. We had some form of YouTube and Facebook and then Twitter throughout 3 or 4 presidential campaign cycles, but for the dominant medium of the communication of an elected to be Twitter, which lacks the nuance and context that all the historical figures and even the contemporary presidents were studied in and practiced, it was a huge difference. And I mean, I point out in the book, there have been, I don't remember if it's Jonathan Karl's book or one of the books is unprecedented about Donald Trump. I remember doing a program with George Edwards at Texas on the Open Mind and asking him just how unprecedented the administration was in its infancy. But to me, one of the most unprecedented elements of the Trump presidency was, here is a president twice impeached running for a re-election. We never have a president once impeached running for re-election. And yes, he was acquitted both times, but that doesn't change the fact that never in our history had we had a president who was impeached and who was running for election. And now, depending upon the committee and the Department of Justice, it's possible you'll have a president under indictment and running for re-election, although not in the immediate subsequent cycle, but running for a second term. That will also be truly unprecedented. And then the final thing unprecedented, I'd say, is never before in history. There have been, I think, Brenda, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think 3 instances of presidents in the sort of modern inaugural era who declined to attend their successors' festivities, not the balls, but just the speech.
The ceremony, the actual
right,
ceremony.
the ceremony. And I think either 2 or 3, Trump was, I think, the 3rd president to not attend. It's one thing not to attend your successor's inauguration. I don't view that as inherently or deeply frustrating the succession, disrupting the succession of legal transition from one president to the next. But Donald Trump is the first president, and I believe, and tell me if I'm wrong, because you're the Andrew Johnson expert, it was the first president to instigate on the day of certification or the electoral counting to actually interfere with that process. To my knowledge, you could probably say Trump was the first president to interfere with the transfer of power, the peaceful transfer of power. And he wasn't, he wanted to, based on the commission's report, he wanted to be in there with the crowd alongside all the people who were proceeding and
exactly.
But even though he wasn't physically there, his incitement of those people to barge ahead and insurrect. Maybe Johnson in his lame duck months, I wonder if he did any other president has done anything sort of like what Trump did. But to my knowledge, no. You would know about the Johnson period.
No, absolutely not. I mean, Johnson, for all his faults, he did not go to Grant's inauguration, right. but he was boarding the coaches to go back to Tennessee. It wasn't as if he was in the White House in some sense refusing to leave or not conceding. And I think, to your point, it's also, as far as I know, no candidate who has lost the bid for president ever refused to concede. Right. I mean, if anything, Al Gore had more reason to contest what happened in the year 2000 than certainly Donald Trump did. I mean, he could have continued on, and he basically said, for the good of the country, I concede. And it's interesting because it's almost I guess you say a sports person's thing. It's the honorable thing to do. Whatever game it is, chess or something, somebody wins, somebody loses. It's unfortunate to be the loser, but that's what happens. So this is, I think, unusual, unprecedented, and as you say, not going to the inauguration is one thing. Not conceding and then perpetuating, refusing the transfer of power in a certain sense is quite another. It brings me to another question about these pieces, and I will stand by the way, the whole idea of these tweets being brilliant, because I think they, as I said, encapsulate the era. Whatever is going to happen, they look forward in a way that a sort of prose analysis really couldn't, in a sense, and they anticipate things. So just as a kind of aside and a quip, I think in your in your next edition, you're going to have the Secret Service tests.
Right, right, exactly. If
And
they're
maybe
ever uncovered, yeah,
you'll be the first one to find them. That's
yeah,
right,
yeah.
and you'll sell 2 million copies overnight. But in any event, I wanted to ask you too, if you especially in putting this together, in the parts that were new to you because you were doing this solo, if you noticed connections. I noticed, let me just say, now see what yours are. Reading this marvelous volume, I noticed, I was fascinated by the recurrence of demagoguery in the country, for example, and I was fascinated by the kind of tension between, and I think this was in earlier chapters, but you could still make an argument for it, between sort of the agrarian and the industrial parts of the country. I'm not even saying North and South, but just sort of those divisions, because people talk about how divided we are today, and we were always divided, it seems to me. For obvious reasons.
Yes, absolutely.
Since
Yeah,
we
no,
both know Charles Sumner, we
mhm,
know him well.
yeah,
But I was
yeah,
wondering about these kinds of things. Just one more connection, and you can pick and choose and have your own. But I was stunned, and I really want to mention this one, was that you have Roe v. Wade in the book, and now it's suddenly has disappeared. One of the things that I found fascinating was the section from Barry Goldwater that I had no idea. I think it was this speech was in the 1980s, so if I'm not mistaken, 1981 or something.
right.
So it was long after he was running for president. It was long after it was sort of he was, I guess, not Andrew, but Lyndon Johnson, and those ads around that era
Mhm.
had him, sort of setting off a nuclear bomb, that kind of thing. And here was Barry Goldwater, and I think of this in terms of Roe v. Wade, actually, talking about how necessary it is to separate church and state. And you really think, wow, what goes around comes around. And it's sort of interesting. So I was making those connections. Did you feel, were you kind of stunned by them, or depressed by them, or excited by them?
Yes,
Just
demagoguery,
all of it.
all of it. Yeah, the demagoguery piece is definitely a recurring theme. What I wanted to emphasize more in this edition was a little bit more of an overhaul than the 10th, because I realized that there were some omissions, and
Mm,
and to use a word you just, sort of stunning omissions in the
mhm.
contemporary culture, that I almost should have known better for the 10th edition. But a lot transpired between the 10th and 11th edition in
Mm.
terms of renewed consciousness around uh, the gender and women's rights movement. The
Yeah.
sort of a footnote now after the pandemic, or in the midst of the pandemic still, the Me Too movement, and
Mhm.
then George Floyd, Black Lives
Right.
Matter, third Reconstruction or new civil rights movement. Um, that had been part of the zeitgeist, but it was also something that I had studied, because I, starting in
Mm.
high school through college and beyond, studied historically Black newspapers,
Mm.
and wrote a lot about it, and
Huh.
so in this edition, um, to represent more fully the nature of xenophobia in America, I
Huh.
included the Chinese Exclusion Act, and
Yeah, yeah. Huh.
there have been three, very clearly racist,
Yeah.
ethnically exclusionary bills that had been passed, limiting immigration on the basis of ethnicity long before Donald Trump. So I
Right,
wanted to
right.
put that in the same kind of recurring um, tapestry as what you're saying with the demagoguery. Um, but what was a clear omission was important voices representing contemporary American political life. So that required going back to civil rights leaders, not just the most obvious ones, but also impactful ones on the national stage. Barbara Jordan in the
Barbara Jordan.
context of Watergate, Fannie Lou Hamer in the context of activism, and not just King and Malcolm X and others who were
No,
important.
exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting.
So, but to your question, I think the most interesting to me was a discovery in updating the 10th edition, which was looking
when was the
back
10th? So when exactly?
after the
we
2016 election. After the 2016 election, so written and then published in 2017, early 2018.
Got it. Okay, just want to make sure. And
yeah, and the edition you read and that was published now by Penguin is the 11th edition. But when updating the 10th edition in the wake of the populist movements of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and the whole kind of rage against the machine climate of 16 against establishment politics, one of the things was going back and reading speeches by Murrow and the speech by Agnew.
I was. Wow, that was shocking to me. That was great.
I mean, and basically, and Agnew is obviously a maligned and infamous figure, but of course, so is Taney, right? And people say, people sometimes have to do a double take. This is American history, as I tried to put eloquently in the very beginning preface. This is an endlessly complicated story of our unfulfilled promises. And moral triumphs and of course original sins, and the seeds of those original sins have continued to manifest, not just in the form of Jim Crow, but in corruption, like Agnew's corruption. But Agnew sort of gave a speech saying, "Look, if we don't take control of the media, we're going to get killed." And so it was almost like Agnew and then Neil Postman later in his.
Oh, that was wonderful. That Andrew Postman.
Yeah. And so Neil Postman, right? And his son wrote an essay in The Guardian that was basically saying how his father, who was a media scholar, predicted an era of communication where it would be diluted to its absolute most meaningless, i.e. Twitter. Again, we're on it. Some of us, we try to make good use of it, but we know that compared to, the longest Lincoln speech or the shortest Lincoln speech, Twitter is not exactly sort of a comparable venue for political speech or scholarship or anything like that. Some people make amazing, fascinating use of Twitter and keep it at an extraordinarily high level, inject history, inject memorabilia, photos, but at its sort of basic form, the common denominator is the lowest common denominator for use of Twitter. But Agnew and Postman, the senior Postman, his father, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, really predicted that someone like Trump would come along and exploit an electorate that was going to only read the lead of a newspaper story or the first sentence of a tweet. And that was the context that so to me, that is the kind of linkage to the present. It's more, my answer to your question is more of a contemporary one. But if you go back to the Murrow speech, well, even if you go back to Walter Lippmann earlier on, but if you go back to Murrow and then you take Murrow to Agnew and then Agnew to Postman, you see how the devolution of kind of literacy.
Some sense of language
was exploited by people who wanted to enact their agenda, but not persuade people through any of the sort of literary
or rhetorical
technique or just fact-based discourse.
No, exactly. And when you've got, as you said, you've got certain leaders, figures like Obama, whose campaigns were saturated by media. I mean, he knew what he was doing, but you read the speeches, the speech, on race. They're just remarkable, really, in that sense. So that's a very, very different thing. Two things about what you were saying in terms of the sort of predictability from kind of Agnew to Postman. I mean, in a sense, Postman is predicting a Donald Trump, but so was Alexander Hamilton. It was the whole thing of the demagogue. Watch out, the demagogues can always come and get you, which
Right.
is absolutely true. One of the things that I thought was fascinating about that, it's not so much the Neil Postman, but it was the Andrew Postman op-ed that was in your book. It's just so stunning. It was that he said everybody knows Orwell's 1984 and refers to Orwell's 1984, but it's Aldous Huxley's Brave New World that should really scare you. I mean, when
Right.
I read that, I thought, yeah, I'd forgotten that, because what Huxley talks about is not even the demagogue, not even the distortions of language or the truncated language, but it's people just too complacent. People just have their creature comforts. And you could also argue that the media then becomes that kind of creature comfort, or whatever it happens to be, not necessarily the media. It could be, I don't know, I guess I can't think of anything, but I guess in the period of the 20s, I forget what it's called in the book, you'll know, but when it's a kind of prosperity and people are, it's a time of tremendous prosperity. It's new Gilded Age, but at the same time, there's tremendous intolerance. And it goes back to what you're saying too. Chinese Exclusion Act. I was actually shocked. I think that was in the 1880s. I always thought it was a little later, but then you get to the 20s and that intolerance, the deportations, and then you get to more of the present, as you're saying. And so I was, I think you just put it very well, as you said in the preface. This isn't it's a feel-good book in the sense that you see the range of opinions and people who are trying to do something, even if it's nefarious, trying to do something. You see that particular range, but it's not always pretty.
That's for sure.
So I think that really is quite something, and really quite powerful. So when you were, did you leave certain sections intact and concentrate on the newer ones for the 10th and 11th edition, or did you, as you were just saying, you added things to certain of the sections? Did you go through and do that in all of them?
Yeah, they're for space. We had to excise as well as add, but there were certain things that were just completely out of place.
That you had to leave out, that
but that made logical sense to omit. I mean, and there was an issue with chronology with I think it was Lippmann, and then there were the speeches by Giuliani, which really just did not make any historical sense anymore. Bush's speech does, especially in light of where he's come out on democratic values and being an ambassador for democracy within the Republican Party, but largely intact. I mean, very few deletions and mostly additions. And when we talk about the newest chapter, it was very important for me to because I felt this way for a long time about the pandemic, not to take a document from Tony Fauci or the CDC, or they have been most unreliable, and I point that out in the book. And in the essay, I mean, I think that I'm just as I intended to be naturally in the 10th edition, quite even-handed, if direct, about what's transpired. because we've never gotten to the bottom of COVID-19.
No, and you make that very clear. I
Yeah.
was interested. I was actually surprised because I don't know how many would actually make that quite so clear, because it seems such a hot button issue for reasons that
Right.
I guess.
And to me, that's just an indictment of the lack of maybe curiosity or imagination, but the absolute rejection of thinking about things in terms of cause and effect. And maybe they're just not enough history majors out there, Brenda, or they're not being taught in the right way to really be perceptive about things. And
Yeah,
I don't know. I suppose
probably both. It's
yeah,
probably
I mean, I suppose it's sort of like the lost cause, the cat, out of the bag in terms of the pandemic and the investigation of its origins. Although with MERS and SARS, there was much more advanced understanding, and so this thing,
and with AIDS too, even though
right,
AIDS was
right,
a political nightmare itself for a while for different reasons,
yeah. Well, and I tried to. The reason I called it sort of cruel feelings, we can talk more about the divisiveness, but the sort of the age of pandemic and insurrection.
Yeah, that was interesting too that you put them together.
Yeah, I mean, we know from past global confrontations and conflagrations that these things normally are cause and effect and kind of collide and precipitate.
Mm.
But to me, some of the stuff coming out right now, just today as we're recording this, there's a documented case of polio in New York State.
One of the I think Jeff or Craig, somebody said that I was stunned.
Yeah. So, and I make direct reference to science denialism,
Yeah.
in the essay and in the preface too for this
Yeah.
edition. I mean, so I actually, not to be a Debbie Downer, but I mean, I don't really see. I'm not surprised by the monkeypox or this polio thing. The origin of the polio is not. It could be from these oral vaccines that actually are living and can make people infectious, and as a result of that, you can take this new generation of polio vaccine that was used predominantly in developing countries, underdeveloped developing countries, and you could, if you weren't vaccinated, you could acquire it. Which a lot of people.
Well, that's why people are afraid of vaccines, isn't
right.
it?
But which was a big hump to get over with the mRNA, because I myself had a lot of epidemiologists on our podcast when we were quarantined more regularly, and I did ask that question of, was there any risk of becoming infectious as a result of taking a vaccine? No, the mRNA vaccines were not living vaccines.
Right, exactly.
But it raises the question, historically speaking, why in the world did we stop vaccinating people for smallpox and polio? And I know that the people who criticized that stoppage, at least there was one essay by doctors or study predicting that monkeypox would become an epidemic or pandemic if we did stop vaccinating folks for smallpox. So I hope that I'm wrong. I truly hope that I'm wrong, but I see this as a decade of pestilence. I mean, I think we were long overdue. A lot of people didn't realize how overdue we were. There had been scares. They had mostly been limited to outside of the United States. But I think that the developments that we're experiencing now suggest that this is going to be an ongoing, if not public health disaster.
Yeah. Well, it's very ominous in that sense, because here we are talking about this. It was sort of, sponsored by the FDR Library. Here we are at the FDR Library.
Right.
Not, but I mean, when you want to talk about polio in that sense,
yes.
What's ominous is not the thing itself. That's bad enough. But as I was talking to people before you came on here, people were thrilled to get the polio vaccine when it was first, invented. People wanted to stop these things. Now there's so so much, I guess it's a phrase, I hate it, but I don't know another one, vaccine hesitancy, that it's bound to lead to what you're calling pestilence, which is
right. And the sort of denialism is or ignorance
or
is
both,
or both, right, are palpable and quite understandable in the context of the botching by the CDC and in our science, regulatory bodies, whatever you want to call them, because that incompetence and the lack of clear guidance about the risk associated with COVID, for which I think Tony Fauci was responsible, especially as it related to mask wearing and the idea that mask wearing, it was only for medical professionals at the beginning of the pandemic, and then he did his mea culpa. No, that was just, I knew that wasn't the case, but we just didn't have the supply, so that's why I said it. But I just went back and looked because I had been curious in talking about this with a few other folks today. But if I'm correct in finding this quick fact, FDR's diagnosis was not a childhood diagnosis.
No. That's right.
I had assumed that because I of how many times I've read FDR biographies and been at the library, and and so with COVID, there was a lot of misinformation by healthcare professionals. And I don't know if with monkeypox, the implication now by a lot of people, or at least the early understanding, is that it's primarily sexually transmitted. But with polio, there seems to be some old, sort of obsolete understanding that you can't catch it as an adult, and it's not going to be harmful to you as an adult. And even if, again, in my conversation earlier, someone was citing 3 out of 100 people are paralyzed. I mean, do you want to take that? That sounds like Russian roulette. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, especially you had a president who was paralyzed.
Right.
I mean, right. You can't get more obvious or in your face than that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. Go ahead.
It's so I tried to place these criticisms or context in the historical perspective, and I do think that that we've smartened up a bit when it comes to having a more even-handed or objective understanding of this period, but I think we just take for granted all these years without novel diseases that became pandemic or endemic in the United States. I think that the active medical community is the community that is most taking in the real life circumstances. But I just don't know that journalists, maybe the historians of this period will, but I don't really think that the journalists of this period have captured adequately how this is a different time than earlier. I mean, it's because it comes from this whole discussion of the pre and post pandemic and
right. Oh God.
Back in the pandemic, and I'm and that has bothered me because it's just so inept and so factually wrong that I just hope historians, because I see journalists falling into that trap of sort of marking an endpoint of something that is clearly not ended, and then.
But it's fantasy. It's journalism. It's journalism is fantasy, if you ask me, in that sense. And sorry,
I'll finish this off as you.
No, go right. I wish you could pass it to me, but in any event, pass me the bottle.
I forgot to mention drinks were included.
Thanks. It's terrible. Get it in the next edition. But the thing is that it'll be too late when the historians get there. I mean, right. So maybe the historians will get there, but I think what you're talking about, and I think what's important in the book, and obviously from what you're saying, informed some of the choices you were making, because there is a sense of urgency, and in a way, that's one of the reasons that I strongly recommend. I really very much like the book, because it doesn't seem over in a certain way. It's very much a work in process. If people think,
Right.
a documentary history of the United States, they think, okay, well, the eyes glaze over and it seems very dusty. And this
Right.
is not the case at all.
Right.
And even the whole idea of the additions, the fact that this is always in process, and that there's a way in which there's kind of a revision that's going on, not just because of new information, but because of the emphases change. People, we've been open for questions, and maybe because I'm a technological, not a technical fool, a technological fool. I might be a technical fool too, but a technological fool, I haven't seen them. So I'm assuming that question, there's a question for us. And it says, which documents from I guess you can read them too, Alexander, which documents from the Roosevelt era? Wow.
Yeah.
Here you got your question.
Yes. Yes. So the document that was actually not in the original edition, like the first set of documents. And again, this was published certainly post New Deal, or at least the inception of the New Deal, was the Four Freedoms speech, which my grandfather added later on. And I think it was really important to do so. I don't know if this is still the case at the library, but I think in the last exhibit, when you walk through the amazing journey of the Roosevelt life and presidency, you have a room dedicated to that speech. Certainly a wall or two, and so that continues to be a kind of unfinished project of the post-war era, where we know now the United Nations and sort of the infrastructure of the post-war period, as envisioned by Roosevelt and Truman, really was envisioned more by Roosevelt than Truman, did not come to fruition, at least not in the way that he had hoped. That would have I don't know if it would have postponed or just canceled the Cold War period to an extent, if the United Nations had been in the post-war period had been conceived sort of under the guidance of Roosevelt, or someone who was more focused on four freedoms. But that kind of Roosevelt or Churchillian pursuit was just, it was not pursued with the same gusto, and I think that I would start with that speech, and just as an addendum to that, I mean, one of the things that my grandfather became late in life very aware of and explicit in sharing with people was that he had found, that he had thought that the Roosevelt Revolution was permanent, and later on, especially as the Rehnquist court took shape in the Reagan and Bush presidencies, particularly, he revised some of the language in one of his earlier essays, to make clear to the audience that the Roosevelt Revolution was not a permanent revolution. Maybe there was some feeling of permanence with Social Security, or some element of the safety net, or the electrification of the country, or whatever. But we know that the New Deal was a kind of revolutionary, urgent policy adopted to fight off the Great Depression, but also to attempt to lay the groundwork for a social safety net, for older and younger folks. And one of the things I've been very passionate about saying to audiences is how both there has not really been a president, a Democratic president, since Lyndon Johnson, that understood. I mean, you could say Kennedy possibly too, was in the same vein, but that understood that with a liberal agenda, you had to make each program understood why it was vital to the public well-being. And unfortunately, I think starting, possibly with Carter, but possibly with Clinton, all the social funding it just became like, technical, like in terms of like stimulus. We're going to talk about like endless. We're going to talk about stimulus funds instead of Social Security, or naming a program and explaining it to people, its virtues, its downsides, whatever. And so that was really since FDR, I think you can argue we have not had a liberal president who was willing to pursue programs with different names in the alphabet orientation and say, we're going to try A and then B and then C, and here's what they're going to do. And certainly we haven't seen a commitment to the nation's older or younger people. It wasn't just Social Security, civilian contributions, all the programs that were geared around unemployment and fixing the unemployment problem and giving people a lifeblood, whether that was cultural lifeblood or, a real livelihood. And so that question made me reflect on Roosevelt in the way that my grandfather did, which was correcting himself and saying it wasn't a permanent revolution. And then if it was a revolution, there was a counter-revolution, which was the Reagan counter-revolution that has become the status quo in America. I mean, another thing that's interesting in the book is just the fact that the whole idea of trust busting, or the antitrust, breaking up the bank, that whole tradition, it fell apart and has never been adopted by Republicans or Democrats in a half century, or maybe over 100 years. I mean, there have been a few high-profile cases, Microsoft, AT&T, Bell, but largely, whatever tradition there was from the Roosevelt era, TR or FDR, of trust busting or subsequent pursuits of
progressivism, or
right. I mean, the interesting thing about trust busting is it can be both a progressive and conservative.
It was Republican and Democrat.
So to get back to the question, there is the For Freedom speech. There is the Rendezvous with Destiny inaugural speech, and then there is a World War II speech, the quarantine speech. And so I believe there are three Franklin Roosevelt, FDR speeches. The first inaugural, then the Rendezvous with Destiny. Those are two separate, so there are four. Inaugural, Rendezvous with Destiny, Four Freedoms, and Quarantine. Here's another question.
There's another question. Oh, dear. Well, I guess everybody can see it, not just us. How do you choose which things to include and what to leave out? I wanted to ask you, I think that's a great question about, because people are always interested in process. What is the process? And you mentioned things going in and out. And I was wondering, do you keep I don't know what it'd be called now, kind of a clipping file? You see things, presently, or you think, oh, I, want to do that. So that would be my addition to the good question.
Yes.
Shut up.
I think there was never, at least my grandfather never taught me or informed me that he had a particular scientific or rudimentary or sort of complicated process of making those determinations. I think it was more about periods and recognizing when the new period was unfolding and warranted that update. And a lot of that is dictated by his editor and now my editor, his editors over the years, and my editor. At least I'm working with my editor for the past two editions, she had a certain sense about the Trump election and the populist revolt, as I called it. And then subsequently, I mean, the pandemic and the impeachments. Probably even if just one of those two things had happened, there would have been cause for or deliberation about a new edition. Again, I went back to the drawing board and I was sort of not surprised, but awakened that there were only Lincoln speeches. If you go back to the 10th edition, like you'd think that Lincoln was the only central figure in the Civil War. And maybe he was as someone who was most impactful. Well, we know he had a team. We know that there were very unusual dynamics that determined his course in office, and then once he was assassinated, and just sort of like the Supreme Court, the flip of a switch, in terms of who his VP is at the time he's assassinated, could have been a whole world of different history that I love talking to you about from the impeachers. And if it had not been Andrew Johnson, if it had been that great abolitionist from Maine, right?
Hannibal Hamlin.
Yep. I'll let you say the name because it's such a great name. And that's the contingencies of history. Taking,
of course,
learning about that in historical sociology with Orlando Patterson, and we read a lot about the role of contingency in history and just not knowing what's necessarily going to happen, and a lot of flips of coins being determinative.
I mean,
but to the question, I knew, both because my heart is so fond of Charles Sumner, but also because Lincoln did not have, this is the difference, right? Lincoln might have been the central figure, might have been the most impactful figure, but he did not have the only perspective about what should be occurring during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. And I think that the way that we, unfortunately, too frequently, the Reconstruction era is taught was that it was inevitable, that it had to be that way. And we, if I may be so bold to say, love Charles Sumner because he was the one in saying it doesn't have to be that way, with real courage.
That's right.
And so including him in the book and in a speech in which he maps out his vision for a post-Reconstruction, just the very basic fact of readmitting states to the Union that had rebelled and were part of the Confederacy after meeting a certain criteria, that was not just the adoption of amendments that we know were not enforced for so many years, but actually requiring formerly enslaved folks to have some stake in particularly land and land ownership, and that members of the Confederacy could not just re-adopt all of their land. And Sumner was the one who said that they should not just re-adopt all their land, and if we want to have any sort of actual pluralistic society in which Black people and formerly enslaved are not sharecropping for a century, we need to do something. But we didn't really do something, and you point out quite brilliantly in your book and when I interviewed you, just how there was the so-called radical Republicans. But even most of the Republicans, they were, neither radical. What was the word I said that you liked on the show? That they were sort of the courageous Republicans. I could go pull up
I can't remember either. I'm sorry.
But in any event, it was important for me in my process to ensure the representation of Sumner. Right. And so that was because there was a period of American history that was not represented, and my grandfather did not include Thaddeus Stevens, who's most largely connected with that movement. He didn't include anyone but Lincoln. And for all Lincoln's heroism, he also had faults, and his perspective was not the only perspective of the period.
Right. That's one of the few instances where I think your grandfather, wide-ranging and astute as he obviously was himself kind of um, very deeply schooled in the idea that Reconstruction happened the way it happened, um, not because it was an alternative, but because it was the only way, and it was unfortunate. It was
Right. Exactly.
tragedy.
And,
And he wasn't alone in thinking that.
correct.
He
Right.
wasn't the
Absolutely.
only smart person who thought that.
Yeah. And I think he lionized Lincoln, and that also
Yeah.
fed into it, and most historians of the era did as well.
Oh yeah.
Righteous. I knew it was a R. Righteous Republicans.
Righteous. That was it. Good. Well, that's great. Well, this is a real pleasure to talk with you. We have to do it more often.
Yes.
Maybe the FDR Library will keep inviting us back. Certainly we'll invite you back. Is there, before we conclude, I just wanted to say, is there anything you'd like to add? And is a kind of aside, are you working on the next edition?
No, but let me just echo your sentiment. It's so good to see you, and I hope in whatever way is appropriate for the health circumstances, that when you release your next book, which might be in a few years, you'll tell the audience when in what year that might be expected. But even before here, right? I hope even if that is a long time from now, or an unpredictable amount of time, I hope to, in some socially distant way, have resume this conversation with you.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's, because I could listen to you for hours and hours about, certainly about all of American history.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, it's no small thing. It's no small book. And I don't mean that in terms of page length. I mean, it's no trivial undertaking. And it's really important, and dare I say it, fun. It actually is fun. I think when you talk about, how perhaps people don't study history, or they don't understand, or they don't learn it, whatever, it's because no one really understands the ways in which it can really be fun, because it's fun to think about things in a new way. It's fun to see the connections. It's fun to be acquainted with people who had different ideas and suggested different ways that the country, like Charles Sumner, could have gone. And I think it's very exciting to have this book, and I'm so really glad you did it. And I'll be looking for it. I hope my next book comes out before your next edition, but
well, look, I mean,
who knows?
I'm not.
I know you're not rushing out, right?
No, and I'm also, there will be a time and place for you to share what your next project is. I don't know if you have, but suffice to say that the project is entirely relevant to our whole discussion about science, and if
it is, and education and religion, which is why I was stunned by the Goldwater. I think I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
Put it in an epigraph.
But I'm excited for that, because it, and I'm not with Roe and the overturning of Roe. It will be deeply relevant for those reasons too.
Yeah.
Understanding what religious advocacy, or zealotry,
or
meant
pluralism,
then,
or even pluralism.
Yeah.
People can have different points of view, different religions.
Yeah.
Make determinations.
So in any event, to answer your question about anything I wanted to add, no, I mean, we covered everything. I just encourage folks who are watching to take a look. Take a look at the book. Take a look at Brenda's books as well, especially the Impeachers, if you haven't. And I think that even if you are not a journalist or a historian or a teacher, things have unraveled, so in such a way that we want kind of an American history guide, to say, oh, is that accurate? Like, and so this is a book that I hope, can be on people's bedside or in their office if they want, to try to get a hold of whether, any of our contemporary figures who are citing history are doing so in a way that is accurate. And and that in and of itself is important to me. Whatever else the book does in the future in terms of teaching particular speeches and the most remembered documents and the most active. I'll just say one last thing. In the wake of Roe, I think it's really important to understand the constitutional implications of the First Amendment. And I've said in some of the book talks that I've done so far, that what if the jurisprudence for Roe, the argument, the constitutionally rooted argument, was the First Amendment, freedom of speech. If the First Amendment is deployed by corporations to raise unlimited funding, it's not freedom to raise money, and speech wasn't conceived by the founders to be, money. That's not the way they thought about that. And so that was sort of a living constitution theory ascribed to the strict construction, the textualism. But I think, to be honest, if there's a Supreme Court that's ever going to overturn the overturning of Roe, there is really no privacy argument embedded in the Constitution.
Right.
Unless you're talking about, soldiers quartered in your home, like there really isn't an explicit privacy protection in the Constitution. On the other hand, there's a very explicit First Amendment right that encapsulates in the original document. It was not just speech. It was a whole bunch of things. And it's fair to say that reproductive health could be understood as a First Amendment right. And if there is going to be a new decision, it's not going to be in the old pathologies and sort of the very fraught grounds on which Roe was decided, which was not
originally. Right.
So I hope that this book also inspires people to imagine the relevance of our documents today for the present era, because especially if there aren't, if you care about reproductive health, and we've heard some real horror stories in the last couple of weeks about induced pregnancies, and just really that make it clear that this is health related, and abortion was always a last resort for health needs, and the stories coming out about women who have suffered immensely already as a result of not having access to abortion because of problems in their pregnancy in states that have now banned abortion and didn't have access to it, and it was an emergency and abortion pills wouldn't cut it. So if you care about that issue, having this book and a document like the Constitution, and not just the Constitution, but then saying, well, this I can attribute this right to FDR's four freedoms, or I can see it even going back to common sense and pain. But we all know that it's in the current political climate quite unlikely for the court to be expanded. So if you're actually working with the current court, and let's say there are one or two justices who are moderate or kind of incrementally flip the balance back to the center, the First Amendment is your argument for reproductive health. there's nothing else. That's the only thing. So anyway.
Where I would conclude with all that, and I think it's actually rather wonderful, is it was something I was going to say, and now I'm going to say it with emphasis, which is, no, seriously, is that this is a book by someone who cares about people who care. And I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. You're so kind.
Oh, well, no, I'm not kind. I'm not kind.
Okay.
I'm accurate.
You're a friend.
I'm always accurate.
You're accurate and a generous friend and truthful.
No, you're a good friend.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you,
wonderful.
Brenda. And my best to you and the family.
Same to you and yours and all of you who could have watched. And now we're going to the January 6th hearing. So
40 minutes and counting. Talk to you soon, Brenda. Be well.
So be well, all of you. Good night.
Thank
Good
you.